Okay, I'd like to welcome you to the second of three repeated orientations for the upcoming workshop and hackathon on multi-scale virtual tissue modeling using CompuCell3D. I appreciate you coming today. The meeting is, as all of the meetings for this workshop, will be live streamed on YouTube and recorded and archived. So remember that, please. The slide deck will be available for future viewing through the Google Drive Student Materials folder. If you have any questions during the meeting, please use the chat function. We'll have an opportunity for unmuting and live questions at the end. And the meeting will take about 90 minutes, I would say, a little less. There's also a workshop Slack channel, which I'll refer to again later on. That's a great place to begin to meet fellow participants, ask questions, get answers. And one of the things that I'd ask you to do today is to make sure that you either have a working nanoHub account if you're going to use CompuCell online, or begin trying installing CompuCell on your desktop so that you have it running by the time the workshop proper starts. I'd like to acknowledge funding from the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, and nanoHub, who've been very generous supporting this project over many years. So we'll talk a little bit about course logistics. I'll talk a bit about background and reading that you might want to do to prepare for the course. I will talk a little bit about the hackathon, and then we will demonstrate very simple CompuCell example to get your hands wet with this. And then we'll have an opportunity for a few questions. We have in principle 130 plus people registered for the course. We'll try to support everyone individually, but if we really have 130 people show up, it may take some time to go around the room. And so I appreciate your patience with that. If you happen to be an advanced or experienced CompuCell user and you would like to help mentor beginners in the course during the period of the course, we'd very much appreciate your help. If you'd like to do that, please contact Hayden Fennell, hfennell@iu.edu, and let us know that you're available. So I'd like to welcome you, and I'd like to talk about what you can do with this kind of modeling. And what we're going to be talking about are what are called multicellular models. We're going to talk about primarily how cells organize to form tissues during development, that is going from an egg to a mouse, for example. Homeostasis, biological homeostasis, that is how an organism maintains itself during adult life, which is why you have the same mouse shown twice, even though the composition of the mouse would change. Its function during normal adulthood wouldn't change. We're going to talk about how organisms fail. That is what are known as developmental diseases. The classic developmental disease would be cancer, where normal mechanisms of development and maintenance are deployed in ways that are deleterious to the organism. But there are many other developmental diseases, ranging from autoimmune diseases like arthritis or diabetes to more unusual developmental diseases like polycystic kidney disease. You could use this kind of modeling to do models of what are called in-host viral infection and immune response. I'll show a picture of that in a few minutes. Model a tissue patch that's infected by virus or bacterium and how that causes damage and how the immune cells clear the infection. This method has been used a lot in understanding toxicology, in understanding how chemicals damage tissues, particularly during development, but also in adults. And it's also been used in the context of bioengineering and medicine to understand how we can control, repair, or design entirely new forms of biological processes. Biology is intrinsically very multi-scaled. There are important biological processes happening at the level of single atoms and simple molecules through macromolecular machines, the organization of organelles in individual cells, the organization of cells into tissues, tissues into organs, and of course, organs together into whole organisms. There's no single modeling approach that can cover all of those scales. There isn't even any way to combine all of those scales in a single multi-scale approach. The levels that we're going to typically talk about here are built around cells as the organizing concept. They're what are called agent-based models, and the individual cells are typically the agents, although those cells can contain components that are themselves agents. And so we're going to start out by thinking about cells and what they do and how they interact. We're going to ask how they're controlled. Those are typically by biochemical networks. Those could be metabolic networks, signaling networks, or gene regulatory networks. And then how those cells interact with their environment and change their environment themselves to build tissues, and potentially going to higher scales as well. In this example on the right, what we call a virtual tissue, this is a picture, an electron microscopy picture of a chicken embryo. You see the formation of the somites, somatogenesis. During somite formation, you are building the periodic segmental structure that's going to lead to the vertebra later on. Here at the bottom, you see relatively homogeneous tissue called the pre-Semitic mesoderm. This reorganizes to form these ball-like structures called somites. That is controlled by a whole complex interplay of both signals and mechanical changes. There is a set of biochemical networks inside the individual cells. There's biochemical and contact signaling between the cells. The cells are differentiating and changing shape and moving in response to those signals. And there also are extracellular gradients of what are called morphogens, diffusible molecules that provide positional information. And this is a CompuCell simulation of this process. In the right-hand side, we see oscillations of one of the particular molecules that's expressed inside individual cells. In the middle, we see a gradient of an external morphogen. In this case, it happens to be something called fibroblast growth factor 8, FGF8. In the right, we see the cells that are responding to that morphogen and to that internal signal by differentiating, changing their adhesion properties, and reorganizing to form spherical somites. And so this would be a typical example of the kind of problem that one can work on with these multi-scale methods. This happens to be a two-dimensional simulation, but CompuCell is intrinsically three-dimensional. And if you want to do these work in 3D, it's easy enough to do it. It just runs slower because the simulations are bigger. These are some examples of CompuCell simulations we've done over the years. The top one is a classic developmental disease, and not as famous as cancer, although it has many similarities, called polycystic kidney disease, where you get cysts forming throughout life in the kidneys, eventually leading to death from kidney failure. So it's a disease of proliferation, inappropriate proliferation of cells. On the right here, we have a simulation of the growth of a tumor. The tumor is sending out vascular endothelial growth factor signals that are causing proliferation of blood vessels. The proliferating blood vessels are in purple. Those blood vessels in turn supply additional nutrients and oxygen to the tumor, allowing it to grow faster. Here on the bottom right, actually bottom left, is a study of laser ablation therapies for diabetic retinopathy, trying to optimize the design of those therapies, so biomedical application. And on the right is also a model of the retina here in 3D, like this one on the top, showing the invasion of the retina by the blood vessels that normally are behind the retina. This is a process called retinal neovascularization, which occurs particularly in age-related macular degeneration. This is diabetic retinopathy and retinal neovascularization are two of the main causes of adult blindness. In both cases, we don't have very effective therapies for it, and understanding the basic mechanisms of these diseases is important in designing new therapies for those diseases. One of the places that this kind of modeling has been used the most is in toxicology, in particular developmental toxicology. These are 3 studies published by the US Environmental Protection Agency using CompuCell. The first one was trying to understand how certain chemicals and drugs can perturb blood vessel development in embryos, leading to pathologies, so developmental toxicology. The second one was modeling urogenital development. Estrogen mimics, in particular in the environment, are known to disrupt genital development, particularly in males, although also somewhat in females. And the issues were to try to understand the mechanisms by which the chemical perturbations at the molecular level played out in gross morphological defects in the embryos. The bottom one is also an embryonic perturbation study. In this case, not of genital development, but rather of the bone plates at the top of the mouth, the palate. In a perturbed development, the 2 bones that normally fuse along the midline of the top of the mouth don't, and you have what's called cleft palate syndrome, which is distressing, non-lethal usually, but distressing disability for children. In each case, the goal of this was to study specifically what the mechanisms of action of toxicants were that were leading to these developmental defects, with the goal of regulating them more effectively. Another area that I mentioned earlier is become prominent, of course, in the past 2 years, is modeling of infection. Here we have a simple model where we begin with a single infected cell. We imagine the cell as a patch of, in a patch of cells in the lung, epithelial cells in the lung. That cell is infected by virus. It goes on to release virus. Immune cells come in, they kill infected cells and also uninfected cells. And we can study the pattern of infection and clearance and damage in the tissue, both under normal conditions, under simulated effects of aging or immune suppression, for example, or chronic inflammation, or we can study the effects of immune modulators or also antivirals in this kind of context. And this is actually a CompuCell model you can run online if you like, through the nanoHub app. So those are some examples. We'll talk more about other examples of the kinds of modeling you can do. But the main thing that we hope you'll take away from this course, if you go through it and do all of it, is first, we hope that you'll be able to look at biological problems and begin to ask what are useful questions that you can answer with quantitative computational models. Computational models are not magic. They can solve certain kinds of problems. They can not solve other problems. They have their own set of strengths and weaknesses. There are a lot of work to build. And it's important to be able to start from a biological observation and biological hypotheses and ask the question, is this something that can be answered effectively with computation? And if so, how? What are the questions that I need to answer? The second thing that you want to be able to do is once you've decided on modeling a biological system, you have to decide on the level of detail with which you're going to model it and how to describe those biological components, which are very complex, in the much simpler abstractions that one uses on a computer. What are the components you're going to model? What interactions will you model? How are you going to translate those into something that can be turned into computer code? And then the last thing we're going to teach you, and the course will probably spend more time on this, although at some level, the first 2 perhaps are the more important things, the more difficult things, is the actual mechanics of translating your ideas into instantiable computer code, the computer code that you can run. CompuCell has 2 main tools called a wizard and a player. Wizard is an intelligent model editor that helps you build CompuCell models. We'll see later today that CompuCell models are built using a markup language called CC3D-ML and the standard scripting language Python. And we'll also talk a little bit about how to display and analyze simulation data to derive biologically meaningful results. In a week, we won't be able to do everything by any means, but we'll be able to get you started on all of those things. And so those are our hope, is that at the end of the week, you'll have made progress in all of those areas. I want to talk now a little bit about course logistics. They're going to be, the Zoom link for the workshop will be the one you're using today. We'll use the same link for the hackathon. There may be some additional Zoom links during the workshop for specialized talks. Those will be provided if they're appropriate, and we'll remind you of the Zoom links before the workshop itself. There's a Google Doc for the hackathon for people who want to participate, which we'll share. And there's also a Slack for the workshop and the hackathon. And Hayden is going to be sharing all of these links so you don't have to write them down. I know it's impossible to write down a long link like this. So those will all be in the chat for you, and they'll be made available separately as well. I assume by now most people are Zoom experts, but in general, screen sharing and microphones are going to be muted for most of this meeting. We can unmute you when you're needed. If you have questions or need help, please raise your hand, type your questions in the chat. We're going to have breakout rooms during the regular sessions where people can go for one-on-one extension and help. If there are any technical problems with the Zoom, you can't see the screen, or I'm talking as if it's a split screen and you only see one, the sooner you let us know, the better. It's pretty embarrassing for our speakers to be talking with a blank screen because they think that they've screen shared their PowerPoint. So please do let us know as quick as possible. Feel free to use the yes, no, go slower, go faster, raise hand buttons to communicate. We'll have people monitoring the Zoom the whole time. One of the things that I'll try it out today is that we will have a poll that will ask the question, are you finished with the exercise? Do you need more time? Are you not doing the exercise? Do you need help? And we'll use those polls to try to make sure that we don't go too fast or too slowly. They're both frustrating for people, and we'll do our best to try to respond to your interests. Some of the exercises are pretty open-ended. They're designed that way so that people who do things quickly don't run out of things to do during the exercise. But as long as you complete the basic part of each exercise, you should be okay. On the other hand, we don't want people to get behind and get frustrated, because even though we meet for a full week, this course moves pretty fast. We try to cover everything, but if you get behind, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to catch up. On the other hand, all the exercises, the videos, the slides are going to be made available in the Google Doc offline. So everything will be available for you to review if you need to between sessions or after the class. All of the sessions will be live streamed on YouTube and recorded and distributed. This course wouldn't exist without the help of a lot of volunteers. I'm James Glazier, Professor of Intelligent Systems Engineering here at Indiana University, head of the Biocomplexity Institute. We have Dr. TJ Sego, who's the lead developer of CompuCell, who's going to be one of the instructors and around to help, especially with technical problems with CompuCell. Gilberto Tomas, professor from Brazil, Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil. He is going to be lecturing and helping. Pedro Del Castel, one of his students, will also be helping. He was very big help last year in the workshop. Professor Julio Belmonte from North Carolina State University will be giving several lectures. A very experienced teacher of CompuCell. Dr. Jim Sluka here at IUB, who's a specialist in toxicology, computational toxicology, will help some. And then we have two postdocs, Joshua Ponte Serrano, who was here and is now at National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, will help us. Priyam Adyapok from Duke University will also be helping us. Hayden Fennell, who's an expert in education involving computing and software, is going to be helping both with course design and with execution. And we may have others who join us who will add to the list. I want to thank all of them for their help in putting this course together for this year. The course schedule will always be the same, starting on Sunday for the Python tutorial. We'll have a brief period before the course starts itself, where you can ask questions, do informal chat with the instructors, troubleshooting, and so on. Then we will have two 1.5-hour modules with a break between them. We'll try to break those down so that they're about 30 to 45 minutes of lectures, about 45 minutes to an hour of hands-on exercises. That may vary a little bit from module to module. There'll be a session in the middle of the day, which may cover problem solving or hackathon preparation, a lunch break, and then two afternoon sessions, again, of 90 minutes each, followed by a short opportunity for questions. If there are more questions that run over, we can extend the time in the afternoon to help people out. There'll also be, again, the opportunity to ask questions, get help on the Slack and by email. The tentative course outline is that we start day 0 on Sunday with a Python tutorial refresher. The level of Python that you need in CompuCell is not very sophisticated, but you do need to know the basics well, because it's something that you're going to be using again and again. And so unless you're an experienced Python programmer, I do recommend that you refresh what you need and refine your skills with that Python tutorial. But if you want to learn Python another way, that's fine too. Monday, we'll begin with simple introduction, a little bit of more examples of CompuCell and how it works, a few simple exercises. We'll talk a little bit about how the engine of CompuCell works, the CompuCell internal methodology. We'll do some basic work with cells and how they behave in CompuCell. And then day 2, we'll dig in. We'll start out a little bit with thinking about how to translate biology into models in the context of multicellular organization. We'll deal with chemical fields and how they behave, how cells move. And then we'll couple fields on day 3 to chemicals, and particularly chemotaxis, haptotaxis, secretion and absorption, which allows us to build things like an avascular tumor simulation. Then we'll start talking about how to put networks into cells, gene regulatory signaling and metabolic networks into cells, and to control their behaviors. Then we'll begin to think about more complex spatial structures of cells, things like epithelial organization of cells, building explicit models of the nucleus of a cell and lamellipodium of cells. And then we're going to also talk about building mechanical models using the concept of links to couple either components of cells within cells or between cells. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how CompuCell can be used in large-scale computing to do optimization, parameter identification. And we'll have 2, this is new this year, 2 breakout sessions. These will be parallel sessions where people who have published important models using CompuCell will present their research, show the code, and teach you how it works. And then on the Saturday and the Sunday, the following week, we have the hackathon organization. We hope that people will get a lot out of this workshop. In our experience, nobody comes to this workshop knowing everything. We've had everything from high school students to emeritus professors take this workshop over the years, everything from pure mathematicians to surgeons. It's a very diverse audience. Nobody comes with the same background, the same goals, the same level of preparation. And that means that almost always, all of us need some preparation to get the most out of the workshop. We try to make things self-contained, but I think you'll find that it's more productive if you are able to do a little bit of background work beforehand. We will do our best to answer questions and deal with technical issues during the workshop. Again, we will always respond to you. How quickly we respond will depend a little bit on how many people actually show up. At the moment, we have about 130 people registered. Clearly, when people register that an online system for a free course, not everybody comes. But if we have something like 100 people who show up, then it may take a little bit of time to make sure that we support everybody. We have as many assistants as we can to work with people. I'd like to talk a little bit about background knowledge and reading that you might want to do. As I say, one of the things about this kind of modeling is that you need to know a little bit about a lot of areas. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in any one area, but very often the way we're educated, we might be an expert in one of these things and know much less about the others. And so the thing to try to do is to identify the areas where you have gaps and try to fill them in a little bit before we get started on the workshop proper. We could divide these concepts into a couple of areas, what I'd call principles of modeling. What are models and how do they work? I've talked about that a little bit before. Programming, practicalities of programming, particularly in Python. Knowing some basic biology, because while CompuCell has been used and is quite effective for modeling materials and materials properties, its primary deployments are in the area of computational biology of tissues. Some physics and biophysics is helpful. It's not essential, but CompuCell is built around physical concept and biophysical concepts. And so knowing something of that is helpful. And then a little bit of mathematics. We'll try to keep the mathematics and physics to a minimum to make things accessible to as many people as possible. But I think you'll find that your experience is a little richer if you have a little bit of mathematics and biology and physics under your belt. I was going to say, it's a Freudian slip to say biology, because the biology is essential. The physics and the mathematics are helpful. In particular, when your model doesn't do what you expect it to do, that could be because the biological assumptions are not doing what you expect, which is what you want. That's the discovery. But it could be because the physics or the mathematics of the system isn't doing what you want. And debugging those things is easier if you have a little bit of physics and mathematics under your belt. Again, we're talking typically about Wikipedia level knowledge. We're not talking about having PhD level understanding of any of these areas. So let's come back to the idea first of principles of modeling. The term may not be so meaningful to people, so I want to go over what it is. And it fundamentally means trying to understand what kinds of questions can be usefully answered by models and how to take a biological system and analyze it into something that looks like a model. And a wet lab biologist might say that they don't do modeling, but every time you draw a diagram of a real biological situation, here we've got a liver, and here we have a model of the flow pattern, blood vessels in the liver, we are building what is called a conceptual model. And biologists tend to think very much in terms of diagrams. And those diagrams are incredibly helpful when it comes to building computational models. The hardest part of building these models is actually this step going from the biological observations in the wet lab to the conceptual model, to the schematic, to the wireframe diagram of the network, to the picture. Because in the picture, you're identifying what you think the key components are and what their key interactions are, what their key behaviors are. Once you can do that, actually translating it into something that looks like a computational model here of the flow in the organ is relatively easy. So one of the most important things is this process of conceptualization, going from real observation to qualitative model or conceptual model to quantitative model, and then to simulation. deciding which pieces are important and which you're going to leave out, which interactions are important and which you leave out, is perhaps the most important and difficult art of modeling. And then if we're going to model specifically things like molecular biochemical interactions, networks, we need to know about how those work. We have to have some understanding of how to validate and falsify models. These are complex models, and so what it means to validate and falsify is something we have to think about, and how to use these to explore hypotheses, to learn scientific facts about biology, to discover new treatments, and so on. One of the things that we'll see repeatedly is a little diagram like this, which talks about how to think about describing models. Models always consist of objects, the things that we're modeling, their properties or states. What is it we use to characterize those things? How those things behave and interact. The dynamics, that is how those behaviors and interactions change the states in time in a continuous way, and events, discrete changes in time. So a dynamics might be a change in the concentration of ATP in the cell. An event might be a cell division or a cell death. One is continuous in time, one's discrete in time. What the initial configuration of each system is and its state, what the boundary conditions are, because I don't model the whole universe, but only a subset of it. How does the system that I'm modeling interact with the outside world? And that could be blood flow in or out. It could be dosing of a chemical with a drug treatment. It could be radiation therapy, and so on. So those are some of the things to think about at that scale. For Python, we don't need a lot of Python. We need to have people know the basic syntax of Python. If you've used MATLAB, if you've used Java, if you've used C++, or any other language, you've probably seen a lot of it. Python syntax is a little different. The thing people probably find most complicated in Python is the fact that it uses indentation to define code blocks instead of parentheses. So that always takes a little bit of getting used to. The way loops are handled in Python is a little bit different from the way they're handled in a lot of other languages. They look similar, but they actually have some different properties. Python has a concept of a list. Lists are relatively common structure, data structure in other languages. Something that may be a little bit less familiar to people is the concept of Python dictionary. And we're going to find that dictionaries are central to the way CompuCell is organized and models are organized. And so the one thing you have to get up to in your Python understanding is how to use a dictionary. You'll see the word class a lot. Python classes are something that CompuCell generally takes care of for you. But if you know a little bit about them, it'll be easier to understand things, especially if they're problems. Again, you don't need to know a lot of Python, but since we'll be using it from the first day of the class, it's important that you have a basic knowledge of it, because if you get too stuck on Python concepts, it's going to be frustrating. It'll make it hard to catch up. We recommend some individual study in advance. We're going to give you some resources to do a little bit of Python review. We definitely recommend taking the Python bootcamp if you're not an experienced Python user. But again, everything will be self-contained within the classes. It's just a little bit harder to keep up. This is a class primarily about biology. It's not about molecular biology. It's not about omics. It's really about cell and tissue biology, developmental biology, cancer biology, immunology, tissue engineering. And so the key things to start with are, what are cells and what do they do? How do cells generate forces? How do they pull on each other? How are tissues constructed? What are the basic types of cells? For example, epithelial and mesenchymal cells, epithelial and mesenchymal tissues. There's some basic core concepts like cell polarity and planar polarity that are very helpful to understand beforehand. extracellular matrix. Tissues aren't just cells. They're embedded in complex matrices of mesh, of polymers. Those have a lot of functions. They tend not to be represented explicitly in CompuCell models, but understanding what they're doing is important. What are signaling, metabolic, and regulatory networks? How do they work? How do cells communicate? How do networks and cell behaviors connect to each other? That's actually a big problem scientifically. It's still not very well understood. What are the basic motifs in biological networks? Are there certain general properties of certain kinds of tissues, in particular things like vasculature or cancer, that we can understand? And how do biologists think about representing information? Again, these kinds of diagrams are very typical of biological organization and representation of information. Being familiar with the visual language of biology is very helpful. When we come to physics, there are a lot of things that are helpful. The only thing that's really critical is to have an understanding of the idea of a constraint, because all of CompuCell models are built around constraints as a concept. You can think of a constraint as a balloon, where if you ask what is the volume of a balloon as a function of the amount of gas inside of the balloon, the answer is that it depends on the temperature, the pressure, whether you're pushing on the balloon, what the material of the balloon surround itself is. Those are basic, simple concepts, but not always taught in introductory physics courses or chemistry courses. It's also going to be important because we're going to talk a lot about chemical fields to have a basic idea of what diffusion is. And in particular, an idea of what a diffusion length and the diffusion time are. We'll cover those in class, but if you understand those from the beginning, it'll help a lot. Again, Wikipedia has good articles on that. If you're interested in under the hood, how the engines of CompuCell work, they're based on statistical mechanics and something called the Ising model and Boltzmann acceptance. We'll talk about those briefly. You don't need to know how those work to use CompuCell. But when CompuCell doesn't do what you expect, knowing how those things work helps you debug it. So that can be useful. CompuCell is, as biology, built on stochastic processes. You have a lot of random movement, thermal fluctuation, random extension and retraction of polymers. Having some basic idea how fluctuations work is useful, and knowing a little bit of general biophysics is useful. The diffusion equation here on the bottom right is something that we will come back to repeatedly. You don't need to know a lot of vector calculus and linear algebra, but having a basic idea about diffusion is important. We'll try to minimize the amount of math you need. On the other hand, knowing what a first order ordinary differential equation or rate law is helpful. The diffusion equation is a simple partial differential equation. That we'll use a lot. We mentioned that everything is stochastic, probabilistic. Having some basic idea of how continuous time rates translate into probabilities is useful. And if we're going to be modeling the regulation or signaling inside of cells, we'll be using network models of network dynamics. And understanding how you represent those mathematically is helpful. Professor Herbert Sauer of University of Washington teaches a course on this subject. It'll be in the third week of July. That course has traditionally been team taught with our course. Some weeks, and we've done it in person as a 2-week course where Herbert comes here to Bloomington and teaches for a week. Now that it's online, they're separated, but we certainly encourage you to register for Herbert's course if you're interested in these things. We'll cover in a very elementary way some of the basics in our course, but if you're interested in gene regulatory networks, signaling networks, and metabolic networks in more detail, Herbert's course is great. In that context, stability and fixed point analysis is quite useful. Again, it's not essential for what we're doing, but it's helpful for understanding the significance of what we're doing. If you want to fill in your background, as I mentioned, each person comes to this course with very different combination of experience. There is a nice paper that was written a year or so ago by a group of Canadian graduate students called 10 Simple Rules for Mathematical Models. It's not quite about this kind of modeling, but it has some useful basics on principles of modeling. There's also a draft paper by our group called The Workflow for Developing Mechanism-Based Computational Models, which we'll share with you. For Python, there's some good online tutorials. We really like the Python exercises, which are free and graded automatically at Rosalind in the context of bioinformatics. Some beautiful exercise, great way to learn Python. But it's not the textbook itself. You still need to have a separate textbook. For network models, tellurium and antimony are the system we'll use. You can get some basic introduction tutorials to tellurium on the Tellurium Read the Docs. Great way to get started there. Herbert Sauro has a wonderful textbook, System Biology Introductory Pathway Modeling, which is available, not too expensive. For mathematics, there's a classic introductory math textbook, but Wikipedia has good articles on the basics of things like stability and stochastic processes. For biology, I love Gilbert's developmental biology. I particularly recommend the older editions. You can buy one of the older editions online for $3 or $4, a 20-year-old edition. The basic principles of developmental biology haven't changed. There's just less molecular detail. And so it's actually a much easier place to start. So I strongly recommend that textbook. For physics, Phil Nelson's Physical Models of Living Systems, good introduction. The best textbook in the field, I think, is Physical Biology of the Cell by Phillips, but that's reasonably advanced. So if you don't have a strong physics background and mathematics background, that can be a little bit intimidating. It's truly a beautiful book. When I used to teach graduate biophysics, that was the text I used, and I do love that book. We have a paper, we need to write a book for ourselves on our modeling methods. We don't have a textbook. Our manuals are as close as we have to that at the moment. But we do have an old paper which introduces the principles of this methodology, which is shared in our resources. And if you come across any sources, reviews, or tutorials that you think we should add to this list, we'd very much appreciate you giving us your feedback on that. Again, where to find resources. There's the CompuCell website. You'll be able to download CompuCell. We'll come back to that in a minute. There are online manuals and help files. There's something called the CC3D Quick Start Guide that walks you through a bunch of introductory exercises. Certainly not required that you go through those, but it's certainly recommended. If you go through those exercises, you'll be completing some of the exercises we'll do early in the course, get familiar with the systems. That is a little bit out of date, in fact, quite out of date. It references CompuCell version 3.6, and we're now at 4.2.x, 4.3. But in fact, almost everything there is fine. Occasionally, the way things look will look a little bit different, but the exercises and the text are still correct. There's the Slack channel for conversations. We encourage people to sign up and start talking to each other as soon as possible. Of course, Google Drive for antimony and tellurium network models. There's that Tellurium Read the Docs. And then there are quick reference guides, which we strongly recommend that you print out, and I'll come back to those in a second. The Slack channel is going to be monitored by our team, but it's also a great way for you to reach out to each other to help each other, because the diversity of the people taking this class is one of its strengths. The quick reference guides, there are three. There's a CompuCell3D quick reference guide. There's a basic guide to Python, a cheat sheet for Python, and there's a 2-pager for tellurium and antimony for network modeling. And I strongly recommend that you print these out and have them as hard copies on your desk during the course. Because during the course, you'll have one window open, which is your CompuCell window where you're working. You'll have a window where you are seeing the lectures and the discussion, and having to flip back and forth to the online manuals during that time takes extra time and is distracting. Having the printouts of these basic summaries is extremely useful. So I strongly recommend printing those out in advance. If you read all three of those quick start guides, you'll be way ahead getting started on the course. If you want to learn more about what's under the hood in CompuCell, as I mentioned, there's this book chapter, Magnetization to Morphogenesis, explaining the technical details of how CompuCell works. And I mentioned already this nice general guide by these Canadian students to mathematical modeling, thinking about biology from a quantitative point of view. We are going to have a hackathon in addition to the main course. It's completely optional, but we certainly encourage you to participate. Our goal is to organize effective, diverse teams, 3 to 6 people each. You don't have to pitch an idea to participate in the hackathon. You can join a team. You shouldn't feel that you can't join a team if you're a beginner. All sorts of people can contribute to teams. We're going to have 2 pitch meetings, July 13th and July 25th. If you want to lead a hackathon team, we ask you to give a lightning talk of 3 minutes to pitch your idea. We'll send out a slide deck rubric, which we ask you to fill in. And we'll also ask you to explain in words your project in a Google Doc, a shared Google Doc. And then the organizers are going to go through those ideas and evaluate them on feasibility. We don't want to rule anything out, but occasionally people come in and they say, well, I want to do molecular dynamics simulations, which CompuCell doesn't do, or they want to do models of the brain as electrical activity, which CompuCell doesn't do. And so we want to try to guide people into projects that are feasible, that can get done effectively in 2 days, and that are appropriate to CompuCell. We'll ask people to participate in the hackathon to suggest 3 projects of the ones that we think are most promising. There'll be opportunities. We'll try to suggest initial teams. We're not going to force people to stay on a team. We're not going to force people to do or not do a project. But we, based on our prior experience, want to help people have an experience that is productive and likely to lead to a useful output at the end of the hackathon period. Over the years, quite a few scientific papers started out life as hackathon projects. Quite a few people also got frustrated and abandoned hackathon projects. We want to try to maximize the number of people who wind up with publishable results and minimize the number of people who become frustrated. So we'll guide people, but we won't enforce strict rules. In the hackathon itself, we'll have check-ins in the morning and at noon. We'll have brief written reports in the evening. And at the end of the whole hackathon, we're going to have broadcast oral presentations and model documentation. And we will be available to help people continue to develop their projects after the end of the hackathon. If you have hackathon ideas, please post them to the hackathon in the Slack channel. Also add a brief proposal to the Google Doc and upload the project pitch, and we'll send out the slide formats for that as well. Again, we'll have hackathon pitches on the 13th of July and the 25th of July. We'll have an opportunity for extra ideas at the beginning of the workshop itself. But the more people who can present on the 13th, the better, because the earlier you start developing an idea and pitching it and getting a team together, the more likely it is to succeed. So the key things in your part of the hackathon are to explain what you want to model and why, in particular, why it's relevant and possible with CompuCell. Of course, you may not know the details of that now, but the more you can think about that, the better. And also some kind of shareable description of your background, interests, and skills. It's okay if you say you have no experience at all. and you want to learn and be a team member, that's fine. We'll do our best to support you. If you're going to do the hackathon, it's important that you have enough computing background to be able to do that. And so we recommend in that Rosalind online exercises, at least do the exercises 1 through 5, they're so-called Python Village, to make sure you're up to speed on that. If you go a little further in Rosalind, that's great as a Python learning exercise. So that was my basic presentation of the logistics of the course and some basic ideas. I'd like to do a quick run through of some basic CompuCell technologies and ideas so that people can familiarize themselves with this before we go too much further. And so I would like to here, I'm going to split, you'll see we'll use a split screen format for the course a lot of the time like this. I have to do a reshare. You'll see the split screen like this here. So we'll have on the left, the lecture slides, on the right, a browser window, or some people may use the desktop version of CompuCell instead. As I mentioned, CompuCell consists of Twidit, model editor, and player, which you'll use to run and visualize simulations. They're both rather complex, powerful pieces of software. We'll do our best to walk you through the basics of them. A lot of it you need to explore on your own. The good news is things don't break when you make a mistake on a computer. The worst that happens is they crash. The first thing that you need to do is have CompuCell running. If you have a Linux or Mac system and you have any CompuCell problems at all, we really encourage you either to get in touch with us well in advance or to use the web-based nanoHub version of CompuCell. For teaching, we'll mostly use the web-based nanoHub, CompuCell. It has some annoyances, but it has the great advantage that whatever computer you're using, you'll see and experience the same thing. Whereas the Windows, Mac, and Linux versions of CompuCell are all slightly different from each other. We will do our best, but we can't promise that we'll have time to troubleshoot installation issues during the workshop. And so if you have trouble installing CompuCell during the workshop, or there are operational issues with CompuCell during the workshop, we'll tell you to go to the nanoHub online version. Because that's it, especially with Linux and some Mac installations, if there are problems, those can take a long time to debug. So if you're going to run CompuCell on nanoHub, and I'd encourage you to try to do this along with me, got ahead of myself a little bit. CompuCell nanoHub links. The main CompuCell nanoHub page is nanohub.org/tool/cc3d-base4x. And there's info on this. It's CompuCell3D/nanohub. nanoHub is an open server, originally developed by NSF. Anybody in the world can log in and use it. It's not as sophisticated as more modern services like Colab, but it is freely available anywhere. And it's the only system of its kind that I know of. The first thing that you need to do if you're going to go to nanoHub is to go to their homepage, nanohub.org, hit login or sign up, and it will walk you through the ways of creating an account. If you are in the United States and your university is a participant, most universities in the US are, you can click log in with an affiliated institution, and that should give you the opportunity to set up an account in about 1 minute. Otherwise, there's an option to sign in with Google, and there's some additional ways of signing in as well. And so I'd encourage people to do that. If you haven't got an account, I'd suggest doing it now, or at least immediately after this, this workshop is finished. It's really only takes a few minutes. If you have trouble getting in, you can contact their help desk here, but in general, it's pretty reliable to get in. Hayden points out that when you register for nanoHub, your account is your email address. And so if you have an email address that may disappear, you have a problem. You have to create a new account. And so we strongly recommend registering, for example, the Gmail address, something that's persistent. Once you've logged in, you will see something called a dashboard that looks like this. It's not the most sophisticated interface in the world, but it's basically possible. You can get to the dashboard by hovering over this upper right-hand corner here. The dashboard simply says what software you've decided to bookmark and what you have running. What you're going to need to do within the dashboard is first to find CompuCell. And if you go to All Tools under My Tools here, and you type as a search term CompuCell3D V4, it'll pull up CompuCell CC3D V4 main tool. And if you click this little heart box, that will allow you to bookmark it. And so I'm going to try checking using our exercise survey. I'll launch the survey. People can let me know if they're able to get that to work. One person says yes. Two people, three people. Okay, so people are doing okay with that. So I'm now going to launch CompuCell. To launch CompuCell, actually, I already have it running. To launch CompuCell, you hit this rectangle here that says Launch CompuCell. In my case, I have already a version of it running. So I hit Open. When it's launching, you'll first get a black square and then a blue square. And at a certain point, it will pull up a screen of the CompuCell player. By default, it will launch with CompuCell player open. So why don't people try that, launching CompuCell? If anybody has it not launched, let me know. If you want to install CompuCell as a desktop application, you can find downloadable versions. If we go to CompuCell homepage here, we go to binaries, and we'll see most recent release. Actually, the number here is out of date. There are newer versions of CompuCell than that. I can select Windows. I go to Windows. I can say I want Windows binaries here, hit download, and it will take me to SourceForge, and I can do download latest version of CompuCell. Here. That will give me for a Windows machine a one-button installer. When you do the install, it will warn you about the security of the install. And so you will have to override security settings to do the install. You may have to install as a administrator, for example. If you have problems with that, you can contact us. With current Mac operating systems, it can get a little more complicated. There are instructions online about what you need to do, but we'll do our best to support you with a complex install, but we can't promise it. Again, that's why we have the nanoHub option, which doesn't require anything to be loaded to your local computer. CompuCell source code, CompuCell's open source. CompuCell source code is available. We strongly recommend against you compiling CompuCell on your own unless you're very experienced. You have rather little to gain by it unless you're actually doing development of core CompuCell. There's always a few people who want to do that. and we'll try to help you out with it, but it's not a trivial thing to do. Okay. So here again, installing, there are one-button installers for Windows and Linux and Macs for the different configurations. Again, you'll have to allow the installation to run as an administrator to do the install. If you want to launch CompuCell on your local computer, you do search for twidit++ and open it. That's the best way to get into CompuCell. Let's actually use CompuCell here to write a little model. It only takes a few minutes. We're going to use twidit, which is the model editor, to write a little simulation of cell growth and differentiation. It's the simulation you see here because I already did this in the earlier version of this startup. To launch twidit in nanoHub, initially you'll see player open. You can go to start twidit here. The piece of paper in the pan is the logo for twidit, or you can go up to the file menu and click start twidit. Either one of those will work. In this case, I have twidit running already. There will be two tabs, and I'm going to go to the tab, which is the twidit tab here. And you should see something like this. One thing that you may find with nanoHub, one of those annoyances I talked about, is that nanoHub doesn't always redraw properly. There's an issue with screen refresh. And so if you get a screen that looks clobbered in some way, what you need to do is go to the bottom right-hand corner of the window and nudge it. And that forces a redraw and will clean your screen up. Occasionally, for some reason, when you're using Zoom, it's hard for me to grab that corner to do the resize. And so you may see me struggle to do that pull a little bit. I don't know why Zoom has that particular interaction, but it's a Zoom peculiarity. Within nanoHub version of CompuCell, all of the window resize, minimize, maximize work. So you should be able to use that. So why don't we see that people are able to get twidit running? So you should have something that looks like this. I can close this since I'm going to start a new project. You should see something that looks like that. Okay, looks like people are getting that to work. And now to write our first simulation, we'll use a GUI for model specification called Wizard. We can launch Wizard either by going to CC3D project and hitting new CC3D project. There are a couple of other places to do it as well, but we'll do that here. So pull down CC3D project, new CC3D project, and it'll pop up a dialog box like that. We're going to have to tell it where to put the simulation and give the simulation a name. And the first thing we have to do is navigate to a place where we can actually write the simulation. If you're local to your computer, any writable directory is okay. Here on nanoHub, we need to make sure that we select our user directory, not the root directory. So we'll hit Glazier, my user directory, and choose. And then I can give the simulation a name, and I can call it just new simulation 2 for today. You can give it any name you like. Avoid special characters and spaces in the name. Okay, hit next. The next thing we're going to do is it asks us how big the simulation is in space. In lattice constants, 256 by 256 by 1 is fine. Boundary conditions of the lattice, lattice type, fluctuations, pixel copies, number of Monte Carlo steps. All of this we're going to leave as default. So we hit next. Then we have to tell it what kind of cells we'll have. Typically, these would be immune cells, macrophages, cancer cells. We could just call it cell 1 and hit add cell. cell 2. Hit add cell. That's all you have to do. And then we hit next. We're not going to have any chemical fields in our simulation, so we'll skip that, hit next. And now we have to say what kinds of cell behaviors we have. And in this simulation, we're going to say we have contact energies, cells stick to each other. The cells grow. The cells divide, mitosis. They have a volume. So we click volume here. And that's it. That's all we need. So I'll wait, make sure people got to that. If you have any problems or questions about that, let me know. Okay, we hit next here. It says configuration complete. Hit finish. And here is our simulation. If I double click on the simulation, it will open up all of the scripts that were created by that dialog. And here I can see some Python that I'm not going to go, I'll come back to that in a minute. We'll walk through what that does. I can use this double save arrow here, save all, to save the simulation. I can also go here under CC3D project, and I could rename the simulation if I want to do version control. To run the simulation, I can either right-click on the top level here, new simulation, open in player, or if the player is not already running, I could hit this CC3D icon here. Or I could go under CC3D project and select open in player here. Those will all do the same thing. I'll right click here, new simulation, open in player. And it'll tell me the simulation is still running. Do I want to stop it? And I hit yes. And in nanoHub, I have to switch my window back to player to see it. So I hope everybody has something that looks like this, or in my case, like this. The layout may be slightly different on your screen initially. And you can hit step, and it should run the simulation. One problem with CompuCell is that it crashed. That's interesting. Relaunching for me. Did it crash for anybody else? This is the problem with a live demonstration. You never know what's going to happen. Okay, I'm going to terminate this. You'll get to see a little bit about how to relaunch CompuCell. I'm going to go to favorites, relaunch CompuCell. Okay. And when you see this kind of simulation, you'll probably want to resize things. You can use the, here I need to probably drag my corner to redraw my screen. And then I can use inside of the system, I can move the corners of my bounding boxes in the usual ways. I can resize within bounding box too, like that. A very useful function is here. If I go under window, if I go to tile under window, it will relay out my screen to optimize for the particular size of image that I have. So I recommend that. And now I can hit, oh, I see. That's why it crashed. When I created my initial simulation, I did it wrong. I made a mistake. So I'm going to reopen, I'm going to open I'm going to open one that I know works. Because I don't want to rebuild it from scratch. All right. Sorry about that. Nothing ever works the way you expect when you're doing a demo. So let me just walk through the player for a second. You've seen me play with it. The first button here says run the simulation. The button here looked like an old cassette recorder. Pauses the simulation. The thing that looks like a record button does a single time step, and the square stops the simulation and resets it. Typically, you don't want to hit the stop button unless you're done with the simulation, because you can't continue from where you were. And that is now a running simulation. So you've actually, if you get this far, you've got simulation running. Now, you could ask, what is the simulation doing? If I run it, let me stop it again and restart it. This is the glitch that I talked about with Zoom. You'll see I have laid out 2 colors of cells. If I step it, you'll see that the cells are going to grow. They'll eventually divide, and when they divide, they change type. That's the basic simulation. I want to walk through what this looks like computationally. Don't worry about following the details. We'll have a week to go through this. I'm going to go back to Twitter. And here's the simulation. CompuCell simulations contain 2 main files, a CC3D ML file that specifies static properties of the simulation, Python file that specifies dynamic properties. If we want to look at that, we can click here and we can walk through either with the tabs. Double clicking on the simulation opens it. We can click on the tabs to walk through the components, or we can double click in the navigation bar here to look at the components. You can scroll here with the scroll bar, resize, and do all of the usual things. Let's look at the XML for a second. The XML consists of a block that specifies the simulation metadata and things like the size of the simulation. For example, at the top, we'll see a line that says dimensions 256 by 256 by 1. It's a 2D simulation, and we see our universe is 0 to 256 by 0 to 256. Next, we see a list of cell types. We created 2 cell types, cell 1 and cell 2. There's always a default cell type called medium. That's the background that's not full of other cells. You can think of that as water in the environment. And those will typically be listed in the player with colors associated with the cell types. Next, we have we say that the cells have a volume here, and the cells stick to each other. So there's a contact energy, and the contact energies are specified here. In this default, they're all set equal to each other. If we go into the executing simulation, we can actually change those energies dynamically. Suppose I want to change the cell 1 to cell 2 contact energy. I could go in and type a new value for that here. Typically, we'll do that in the editor, but we can do that also. Simulations run to see how those parameters affect the simulation. CompuCell has a concept of what are called plugins, which are things that are done inside the core algorithms. It also has a concept of steppables, and you'll see my first simulation steppable, which are typically in Python, which are executed in interleaved with the updating of the cell lattice. We'll go into that detail later. One of the things that we typically do in a steppable would be to draw the initial conditions of the simulation. In this case, uniform initializer draws a rectangle of cells. We specify the size of the rectangle. We specify how big the cells are, whether they're touching each other or not, and what kind of cells we want in a random pattern in the lattice. And that will give us the initial condition that we had here. Where you see a square with two randomly distributed cell types. We also have Python. We can look at the Python. Here's the Python steppable. If this looks unfamiliar, we suggest that you look up the basics, but we try to make things as easy as possible. One of the things that Twitted is very good at is it has what are called code snippets. So if I want to know how do I do something to all cells, I come down to visit all cells, and the code that I need is pre-defined. So I have built into Twitted templates for almost everything that you'd want to do. Usually the hardest part of Twitted is to remember which of the many menus are hiding the thing that you want to do. So figuring out, remembering where things are takes some work, but once you found it, most of the things that you'd want to do most of the time are already there. It makes it a lot faster to write these simulations. Let's just look at one example. Here we have something called the start function that's executed once at the beginning of the simulation to define how the simulation is structured. We go through a typical line, which we'll see many, many times. It's called an iterator for cell and self.cell list. This does something to every cell in the simulation. Why the cells have a target volume and the lambda volume is something that we'll talk about later on. But you can think of target volume as being equivalent to the mass of the cell, and lambda volume is 1 over the compressibility of the cell, if you like. One thing we'll find in these kinds of models is nothing exists unless we assert it. So if we don't give the cells a volume or compressibility, they don't have it. So we can think here of a bunch of balloons with an amount of gas in them and the compressibility for the gas. The step function is something that is executed once per time step. We can call it less frequently if we like. In this case, we're going to have the cells grow. So we iterate over all cells in our list, and we set their target volume to be bigger by 1. You could play with that easily enough if you like. We want our cells to divide, and we have a second steppable called mitosis steppable that takes care of that. Here we have to do a little bit of Pythonic intervention. We create a list, an empty list, where we're going to stack the cells that we're going to divide. We check if our cell volume is bigger than a threshold. Very simple doubling rule. Real biology is more complicated than that. If the cell is bigger than the target, we say we're going to add it to our list of cells to divide. Then we go through our list of cells to divide. The reason we can't divide the cell at the time we find it is that Python has a problem if you change the list you're iterating over. So that's why you can't do that. That's why you have to do it in 2 steps. We go over the list of cells to divide. We have a function that divides the cell. And here it's going to divide it along a random orientation, but we could also divide it along other rules. And then once the cell has divided, we have to say what's going to happen. And in this case, we say that the daughter cells inherit half of the area of each parent cell. And other attributes of the daughter cells are the same as the parent cell. So these are very powerful functions because they implement things that would take dozens or hundreds of lines of code to do independently. And then the last little twist on this is we say if the parent cell was of type 1, cell 1, we make it of type, the daughter cell of type 2. If the parent cell is of type 2, we make the daughter cell of type 1. So the parent cell keeps its type, the daughter cell takes the opposite type to the parent. And that's the full specification of this simulation that we showed here. You can see the types changing. You can see growth and cell division, and I could zoom in to see how that works in more detail. So that's running a simulation. It's a pretty simple simulation, but nevertheless, it only took a couple of minutes to write and run. So again, to prepare for the class, please make sure you can get CompuCell running. Try to figure out how to load, edit, and save a CompuCell simulation, a little bit like what we did here. You might want to try running some of the package demos that come with CompuCell. We particularly recommend steppable-based mitosis, angiogenesis, and delta notch signaling. Steppable-based mitosis will allow you to explore cell growth and division a little bit more. Angiogenesis will help you explore chemical fields and chemotaxis and the organization of blood vessels. A delta notch will get you into how do you model cell signaling and intercell communication. We'll go over those in the class, but if you played with them before and they have some familiarity, that would be great. If you can start reviewing any of the core concepts that you feel that you need a refresher on, that would be great. Again, you don't need to be an expert, but having some experience with them will make the course go more smoothly and more productively for you. If you want to participate in the hackathon, please think about a project, either as a participant or as a proposer. If you want to propose a project, we encourage you to try to do it on the 13th of July. If you can't do it then, on the 25th. Don't worry, even if you can't do it on the 25th, you'll have a backup opportunity at the beginning of the class. But we want to make sure that we give you the support you need to make your hackathon project work. So that is the end of the presentation, and I'm open to questions, comments, or suggestions from anything I can do to help you out at this point. You can either put questions in the chat or you can unmute and just speak up.
I have a comment.
Sharon, go ahead, please.
Just that in this kind of display that you're showing right now, that text is really, really small. I don't know if there's a lot you can do about it, but it is pretty hard to, like, when you point at something on that screen, I have to look real close to figure out what you're pointing at. But I understand there's constraints there.
Right, that's unfortunately not a lot I can do about that. The split screen works really well if people have big external monitors. It's not as ideal if you're on a laptop, especially a small laptop. But our experience over the years is that having the screens side by side works better than switching back and forth between the slide deck and the working code. And so I wish I had a better solution for that. If people really can't see, you can remind me to change the font sizes in the editor, for example, and I can try to do that for you.
That might help.
I'll do my best. Remind me of that when we do it. Zoom unfortunately interferes with the font sizes in Twitter, so that sometimes gets to be exciting, but I'll try. Any other comments or questions? Maybe I could just get a show of hands if people are here. How many people, you could just hit the hands up, the raise hand button. How many people were thinking about doing a hackathon project? 1. How many people would be interested in participating in somebody else's hackathon project if there were an interesting one proposed? 2, 3, 4. Okay, great. So that's good. That makes it important that we get some hackathon proposals. They don't have to be fully formed, but even rough proposals on the 13th and 25th will be very helpful. Give us an opportunity to try to build some teams and get some really good projects together. And we may some of the organizers may try to come up with some possible projects on our end as well. But the issue there is if an organizer is leading a hackathon team, then they can't be helping other teams. And so we want to make sure that our primary responsibility is to make sure that we help the teams that are proposed. Any other questions before we break? I hope people were able to get into the Slack channel all right. If people need help, reach out to us through the Slack or through the email. And I hope that the resources that we provide are useful to you. I'll see many of you, I hope, on the 13th. And if not on the 13th, the 25th. And if not on the 25th, then at the end of the month when the workshop proper starts. Thank you all for showing up today. And I look forward to working with you in the next month. Bye.